The Portal is a living thinking community. Becoming a member of the Portal gives you access to 4 live events every month, but more importantly, an opportunity to learn how to think with others, to learn with online creators and para-academics, and to develop your own capacity as a philosopher. Becoming a member of the Portal also gives you access to the history of our recordings, as well as discount access on past and future courses. This year, members also get exclusive access to the Slovenian School Reading Group, as well as the year-long course focused on Deleuze and analysis. To learn more or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name is Cadell Last, and I'm here with Stijn Vanheule. Stijn is a clinical psychologist, a professor at Ghent University, and a psychoanalyst in private practice at the New Lacanian School for Psychoanalysis and World Association of Psychoanalysis. He is also the author of books The Subject of Psychosis, a Lacanian Perspective, and Diagnosis and the DSM, a Critical Review. Today we're here to talk about his most recent book, namely Why Psychosis is Not So Crazy, and really looking forward to this. So welcome to the podcast, and maybe we'll just start off with the name of the book and what you're trying to say with this book, and then we'll dive in deeper to some of the core chapters.
All right, very good. Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm glad we can talk about the book, and I'm glad also that you were already referring to the title because, of course, that's not a random choice title for a book. And here, why psychosis is not so crazy is, of course, it's playing with psychosis and crazy. But it's already something of, and that's why I attempted to do something of an intervention in the field where there is a lot of stigma. In the general public, there is really like a very negative view of psychosis. Psychosis is really linked to dangerousness. Psychosis is linked to hopelessness, to unreliability. And that's exactly the things that I wanted to challenge, not by like doing some anti-stigma campaign, or like by really discussing like violence and things like that very directly, but just by showing or presenting a different perspective on the question of psychosis. And here, my background is in psychoanalysis. I've been studying Lacan's theories on psychosis quite extensively, and I do believe that there is this alternative view in Lacanian psychoanalysis that goes against all these stigmas of the dangerousness or the unreliability or the hopelessness that is sometimes linked to psychosis.
You've got such a deep background in Lacan. One of the interesting things to me in studying, let's say, the difference between Freud and Lacan is that Lacan starts his career, if I remember correctly, with the challenge of psychosis in a certain way, which is starting with a different problem than sort of Freud with neurosis. How do you think Lacan's specific view on psychosis is sort of informed by the early challenges he's facing in his doctoral work and beyond?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's also indeed my way of reading Lacan. Is Lacan started from psychosis, and this is very obvious because he was trained as a psychiatrist, and especially in these days, psychiatry that meant psychiatric hospitals, and who were the people who were hospitalized. It was mainly an audience. It was mainly people with psychosis, and when we check the different departments, the different clinics where Lacan has done internships, it was always on psychosis wards. So that was his first clinical experience. And no wonder, in that respect, that his doctorate from 1932 was also a question about psychosis. So that was really for Lacan. The clinic was first, then psychoanalysis entered the game. And the clinic was the clinic of working with psychiatric patients, with psychotic patients. For Freud, the clinic started with neurological, pseudo-neurological complaints called hysteria, and then he developed psychoanalysis. Lacan did not truly develop psychoanalysis, he kind of adopted it and elaborated it, but the clinical starting point is different. And in my reading of the entire oeuvre of Lacan, many of the breakthroughs in his teaching start with formulations on psychosis, which he gradually generalizes to other problems. So the conceptual apparatus used in the different periods of the teaching to discuss the problem of psychosis, because Lacan returns to the problem of psychosis many times. Well, it could be that I'm biased because I'm focused on psychosis, but I do have this hypothesis that the innovations start when he returns to the question of psychosis. Um, yeah, we can maybe talk
Yeah,
about
yeah,
it later
that's
on,
great.
but
Sure.
well, that's for me indeed the point that Lacan is a psychosis thinker.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a fantastic point, and sort of a connection I wanted to make early on, because it's, goes right to the core of what is the clinic and what is psychoanalysis doing. You start the book with this idea that um, we as human beings are storytelling creatures. We tell stories about our past. We tell stories about our desires. But that in psychosis and in psychoanalysis is really a talking therapy. It's the talking cure. But you emphasize with psychosis, there is no shared language. Language breaks down. The other no longer functions in a certain way. So what is the difference? And I mean, that's so confusing to me in the sense, because how does a psychoanalyst approach a problem where language isn't basically functioning?
yeah. So, of course, well, that book, Psychosis, Why Psychosis is Not So Crazy, it's a book written for a general audience, as you could notice, um, and which means that I don't use all the concepts of the Lacanian apparatus in that book, but they are behind my construction that I make there. And and so the question that you address about the language is, of course, the question about the status of the symbolic register in psychosis. And there, Lacan's point is, well, language is there, strictly speaking, in the sense that people still know words, the vocabulary is there, people know the grammar of their language, but at the same time, language becomes very there is something of an estrangement in the relation between a subject and language at moments of psychotic crisis. And that was what Lacan was triggered by, and what led him to develop this idea: what is specific to the status of the symbolic order in the context of psychosis. And then in his works in the 50s, Lacan will launch the idea that there is foreclosure, meaning that something that has to do with the law, um, which Lacan had been articulating already in relation to Claude Lévi-Strauss, who discovered that there is indeed in the social relations there is a law, and that law can be described in linguistic terms. Well, Lacan's point was that in psychosis, something of that lawfulness that coheres with language, that is exactly what is not functioning in psychosis. Um, and that then is indeed also for me in the book, Why Psychosis is Not So Crazy, the starting point to address what is so specific to the psychotic experience. And for me then, when when we turn a bit to later Lacan, it's not just a question of how the symbolic is organized, but actually it's a question of how the imaginary, the real, and the symbolic are spontaneously intertwined. But what is it that happens in psychosis when something of the symbolic is missing an ordering element? What is the implication for the coherence or the connection between these three registers? And that's for me behind the question behind the book. Um, and exactly what Lacan helps us to think about about psychosis.
Well, this how are they intertwined, and how are they all connected, seems to me to be at the level of the way when the symbolic's functioning, you say that stories smooth over troublesome cracks, but that when the symbolic's not functioning, it's almost like this crack explodes to the surface.
Yeah.
And you emphasize that for people with psychosis, their world is turned upside down. They start hearing voices. People around them they might project dark intentions onto them. So is this kind of a latent potential within every individual, or how are you understanding this? I know you emphasize that genetics might play some role, but it's a much smaller role than we tend to think. It's
Yeah.
kind of more of a social environmental situation.
Well, the thing is that when we check the psychiatric explanation, um, well, this didn't hold the promise that it was having like maybe 20 or 30 years ago, or maybe in the 20th century. There has this long-standing belief that psychosis could be explained in biological terms that start with Kraepelin, and it informed the DSM and the entire project around the DSM, and the idea that something of the DSM would in the end be grounded in biological research. But that project has been disappointing in the sense that there are no biomarkers for psychosis. There is no brain scan, there is no blood test that can be used in diagnosis, let alone in treatment. But also, for example, at the level of genetics, um, it's a very small percentage of the variability in psychotic experiences or psychopathological experiences that can be explained by genetics. It's around 8%. So these models lost lots of their explanatory value or the promise of explanatory value. And then for me, Lacan offers a different model. And the Lacanian model does not start from the idea that people with psychosis are really different from those who don't have psychosis. I think Lacan starts from a very universal claim about the human being. And the most universal claim that Lacan has about the human being is that we are in a situation of non-rapport, meaning there is a very central incoherence or a very central inconsistency in how people function. And this inconsistency um, is most central to the, well, what you could call the existential domains of human functioning. Um, we have self-awareness. We know that we have a body, we are aware of the body, um, and we tend to, we look for how to relate to what we feel in that body and how that body looks. But therefore, Lacan, the relationship that we have is not a given. And that therefore it's a non-rapport. It's not something that has a standard solution. And non-rapport means what Lacan would also say, like it's not written. It does not stop not to be written in the sense there is no formula. And that's the first problem, how the human being relates to himself and to the own body and to what lives in the body, to the drive, the Freudian drive. Um, but that returns at several levels, like also at the level of sexuality, where Lacan's famous claim will be there is no sexual rapport, um, sexual identity, uh, relating to a child, relating to parents, relating to the fact that we will die. These for a human being are all challenges for which there is not a given answer, meaning that it's not written in our genes. The biology is not telling what exactly we should do when we want to raise a child or when we have a relationship with someone. We have to invent, and this is like the universal problem of the human being. And then Lacan will say that we use the symbolic, meaning culture, as a pre-given, somewhat structured and ordered thing with linguistic articulations. We use it as a human being to kind of deal with these challenges. And what is then the difference between neurosis and psychosis? It's not that the basic challenges are different. It's not the difference is not at that level, but the difference is in how much support the symbolic order is given and how much belief people can have in this ordered set of ideas that is there as a pre-given, uh, which you in some way or another have to accept and which you have to believe before they can function for you. And their psychosis is rather a problem at that level in an inability to trust, whilst neurosis is the trap of trusting too much and then being disappointed for the fact that what happens is not along the lines of what was promised, but the promise is something that you yourself were believing in. And so then psychosis and neurosis are like different ways of responding, of dealing with that basic problem. But it's not that psychosis is the more sick version for Lacan compared to neurosis. It's like as if it's two strategies in dealing with the same problem.
For me, I think it's so interesting to think about the historicity of this problem in the context of the origin of psychoanalysis to today, in the sense that when Freud was starting, perhaps the dominant strategy and the dominant problem were what you're describing as the neuroses, perhaps too much belief, perhaps too much trust. But now, you're emphasizing, I think you were saying in the last few decades, there's been an increase in psychosis for these social problems. And that would signify that there's something transforming, something different about our symbolic order today in the 21st century than in the early 20th century. Do you think it has some connection to secularity? Does it have something to do with the capacity for people to embody and inhabit the symbolic order from the mode of a religious signification, or do you make any sort of speculations in this direction?
Well, also aligning with research, I think that especially social disruption is something that is most closely linked to the question that Lacan is dealing with when he discusses the symbolic order, because this is also something that we know and that I somewhat discuss in the book from epidemiological research. For example, we know that people who underwent trauma as a child, whether it would have been abuse, um, like sexual abuse, or neglect by their caregivers, this is something that we observed that this is a predicting factor for psychosis. Another predicting factor is, for example, when you belong to a minority group, meaning belonging to a group that is excluded from society, that has negative opinions from the dominant group, a group that is stigmatized, that's a predictor for psychosis. And also living in anonymous environments, like in big cities where people have no or very few connections with one another, that's also at the level of epidemiological research a predictor for psychosis. For me, this is exactly what it might mean that the symbolic order is not coherent. Because, for example, when there is abuse, what is abuse? It's exactly a violation of the symbolic order, because what is the symbolic order is, for example, the father and the mother. But when we say father and mother, um, this is connected to the law, because a father is someone to which we attribute certain things that he should do or that he can't do. And the same is true for the mother. And what is trauma? Trauma is what when the father does things that go against what the father must do. Like, for example, incest is trauma because it radically goes against the role of a parent at the level of the symbolic order. So for me, I see that for especially that link between social disruption and exclusion, um, and Lacan's ideas at the level of the symbolic order. Um, Whether it is the case that the somewhat collapsing of our belief systems in the Western world, um, be it the religious one or other ideological systems, whether that has a strong impact on psychosis, I wouldn't know that. I think it's more the question of relating to one another, which is for me also more specific. in how Lacan, in line with the structuralists, thought about the symbolic order. Symbolic order is the question of transactions between people that are symbolically mediated. And so for me, it's rather there that that the link could be made, that psychosis problems today and indeed disruption at that level, that there is some relationship.
That's very helpful. I think that, what I'm taking from your perspective there is, the challenge of the modern city, the challenge of urbanization, even the challenge of globalization. And we could even say maybe if you would agree, I don't know, but that the modern city, urbanization, globalization, that these things challenge what were the coherence of our symbolic order, and that there is a challenge of recohering, and it, is the stakes here that if we don't take on this challenge, if you accept this presupposition, if we don't take on this challenge, that we would expect psychosis to increase?
Well, that could be prediction, and I think that prediction makes sense. But as a clinician, I can immediately also indicate that, well, when we do create a recoherent or recreating the coherence, I must say, when something of that level is done, that this has a positive impact on psychosis. Because exactly when we look now and what is done in the recovery movement within the field of psychiatry is exactly doing that. Because what they observe there is when you create environments where connectedness can occur, where people again can have roles that are respected by others, when there is again hope. And what is hope? It's like having a time frame in which you can anticipate for a future, which is crucial for a symbolic system. Time is symbolic ordering. So these, for example, are three very important factors for people when they're in a psychotic crisis that kind of define when the crisis will stop. When will the crisis stop? It's usually when connectedness occurs again, when hope reappears, and when people again can start taking roles that are relevant in relation to others. So that there is this connection between uh, taking care of the symbolic and helping people to reconnect to to something of a symbolic system that actually is somewhat of the solution for psychosis. But and at that point, perhaps our contemporary culture is very interesting because we are, um, or we used to be kind of very tolerant for the fact that we have subcultures, that, and meaning a subculture is variations to something of a dominant culture, and and that creates possibilities, subcultures, because then you can, together with others, define the standards that work for you at that micro level. And I think that holds promise for the question of finding good places for people to overcome psychotic crisis, that it might be in such like neo groups where something of a symbolic stability can be found again.
What's coming to my mind, that was very great, and I think very relevant in some, inside baseball way to the types of things that I'm interested in building at Philosophy Portal and associated projects. Those subcultures where we can have meaningful symbolic roles. It does feel like that has eroded in my generation, and I think on even a higher level, perhaps among Zoomers. And there is a troubling aspect to that, and I think there's a big work to be done there. But bringing it back to sort of the psychoanalytic dimension of this is, of course, for neurotics, there's this process of free association that the clinic is helping facilitate. But it sounds like with psychosis, you're emphasizing kind of something outside of the clinic that has some sort of tangible integration in practical daily affairs and day-to-day relations, like you're saying, helping people reconnect to the symbolic system. Throughout the book, you give examples of this, of reconnecting to day-to-day labor, or being reintegrated back into society. So what is your role as a clinician, or what is the clinic's role? Is it more to facilitate a reconnection to the world, and what does that look like? How does that take place?
Yeah, well, it's certainly about the reconnection, I think. But here, from a psychoanalytic point of view, we will start from the assumption that the psychotic symptom, like a delusion or a hallucination, is not so much to be seen as, from a medical perspective, as a bad thing, as that which must be removed as quickly as possible. But there is a link in how we, from a psychoanalytic perspective, look at these symptoms to how we address the neurotic symptom, because also in neurosis the symptom is not just to be removed. The symptom is expressing something. Well, from a psychological perspective, the symptom in psychosis is already a treatment. It's a way of dealing with a more fundamental problem. um, and so what we will try to do in the treatment of psychosis, I think, Jacques-Alain Miller has this idea of conversation, as opposed to free association. What is conversation? Conversation is two people talking to one another. Um, um, and he says, like, just there is free association that jumps from one idea to the other in a single person's speech. Well, in the same vein, conversation in the context of psychosis should be in connection to someone else, talking about topics, but also with this switching perspective in mind. So that means that there are many things to talk about. Maybe we can talk about the psychotic experience. Maybe we can talk about aspects of a delusion or the impact of hallucinations, but it's interesting to also switch to other things, um, because people live and people are continuously in an attempt to find something of a connection and a reconnection. But the thing is that as a psychoanalyst, we don't know on beforehand what it will be for someone. So that's always very specific to a person. And so therefore, conversations is the attempt of looking for topics that are maybe also connected to the psychotic experience itself, but looking for elements that create something of a connection. And these are often elements from daily life, around which a joint project can occur through the transference. So some people will gradually also talk about what they are studying, about their jobs, about maybe their creative work, about what they've been reading. And because there we don't make random choices. When we make a choice to read a specific novel, that's subjective, that choice. So in the same vein, we talk about lots of things, assuming that the things that we talk about through conversation is something of a treatment for that basic problem. And that's what we engage in. And in the back of the mind, here for me as a psychoanalyst, is always the question, but what is that specific non-rapport? What is that specific um, incoherence that a person has been confronted with? What is that troubling element of the real that is so very difficult? Um, and that might be something at the level of sexuality, that might be something at the level of love, that might be something, well, in relating to your own body. But there will be something of that in the background. And so it's treating psychosis is also finding ways to encapsulate that troubling, disorganizing element in such a way that it's not denied, but at the same time that something is being expressed and that something of an ordering in dealing with it is created through the treatment, actually.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but in psychosis, um, this non-relationship is harder to identify through free association, because there's just a fullness, or like like where the lack, somehow there's a different relationship to lack, or there's a different relationship to the non-rapport. How does this, how does, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, what's the difference between treating a neurotic with language and treating a psychotic with language in regards to the non-rapport? Is there a different positionality? Is there an inversion in relationship to the non-relationship?
Well, there is certainly lots of differences, but at the same time, it's the idea here also in psychosis that what it is that is the non-rapport is being expressed quite
Right.
directly in the psychotic
Yeah.
experiences itself.
Right.
Like, for
Right. Right.
example, that's the way Lacan would read Schreber.
Right.
Um,
Right. Right.
uh, what Schreber's delusion is an exact expression of the fact that his relationship with paternity is a problem for Lacan, and we
Mm,
see it exactly. And for example, his struggle with God, with the father is God, and he's not functioning as a father; he's functioning in a weird way, and that's Schreber's problem. That he's not a father enough for in for in relation to Schreber. So that's a direct indication that paternity is the problem in Schreber, uh, and and that's the thing. So the non-rapport is quite specific, and the main question is, can we find or help someone inventing a different solution in dealing with that problem than the delusion or the hallucination? Because that, you could say, is a very spontaneous attempt to solve something of that problem. And here the question is, can we find a variation to treatment, in the sense, a different kind of response to that problem? Um, and here in psychoanalysis, I think it's quite crucial that through the treatment of psychosis, we uh, attempt to recognize something of the basic problem. Just like what happens in neurosis, neurosis is also recognizing something of the lack that you've been confronted with. Well, in psychosis, the question is also recognizing something of the real, something of the overwhelming real that they have been confronted with. And then the question is how to deal with that real, how to find an existence in relation to that threatens to wipe away your existence. And that's the whole attempt of what we try to do also, for example, through talking therapy, but not only through talking therapy, because
right.
often the treatment of psychosis really goes beyond the question of having individual conversations and individual therapy sessions with someone. And that's why often the treatment of psychosis also takes place in an institutional context where there is much more, or in a network context where there is much more of what can be done in treating that basic experience.
And what is the role of the analyst in relationship to that institutional or network context? Is it networking or collaborating with other professionals, or is it, what concretely is it? I take, and maybe I also, before going to that step, we should clarify what the difference is between free association and conversation for the analysts themselves. Are you, as an analyst, in terms of your disposition, um, trying to explore a different method through conversation that's more project oriented and trying to facilitate a transference dynamic that's different than when you're dealing with a neurotic specifically?
Well, the main difference is, in first of all, in free association, it's the analysand who is just speaking in such a way that we encourage them to say everything what comes to their mind. Huh? Why would someone do that? Of course, it's because it's the belief that there is a clue in that material that will occur. Something is to be heard over there. And then we have an analyst who is in a transferential position, meaning it is assumed, and that's only why the analysand will do this kind of free associative talk. It is assumed that the analyst will hear something in it, and that by the analyst will intervene into that material that comes with free association, and that along that way, you will come closer to what is the truth of your problem, or more broadly of your being, your existence. That's the dynamic in neurosis. In psychosis, there is no such thing that there you could say the unconscious behaves in a different way. And how does the unconscious behave? Well, the unconscious is always already intervening. And that's exactly how we will think of hallucinations. A hallucination is actually the unconscious that is heard from outside. Huh? So there is something of a perplexity there. So there is no need, you could say, for free association, because the automatism of associations is what already happened before someone is addressing the analyst. There is already this confrontation with a disturbing message that has been revealed to them. And so actually the one who knows about it is already the analysant in psychosis. So there is no analyst needed to hear this message because it is already heard, the message. The revelation is already there. So what we need in that context, and that's an idea that Lacan will articulate in his main paper on psychosis, like the one on a question prior to any possible treatment of psychosis, there he say that the analyst needs to function as a witness. Huh? He is the one to whom a testimony is made about his experience. And you have to be, says Lacan, in a certain sense, the secretary. And who is the secretary? That's the one who's taking notes, who's listening to someone, and who is trying in the dialogue with the other to systematize what is being said, but in such a way that it stays comprehensible. And so the secretary is the one who tries to stay in the conversation with the one who is in charge, and that's the patient. And so here we have a different transferential position, which is quite important, because what is the danger in the psychotic transference? Well, it's exactly that when the analyst would know, when he would end up in the position of knowing something about the patient, that the delusional expectation enters into the transference, meaning that the analyst becomes or a neurotomanic figure or someone who is threatening for the analysant, and then it will stop. So therefore, to be a secretary, you have to be humble, because the secretary is someone who doesn't know, because it's the other who knows. The secretary is just taking notes. So for Lacan, or for the Lacanian analyst, in working with psychosis, will be the barred other. It will be the one who is lacking something. You are the castrated other. Whilst in neurosis, there is the illusion that the analyst knows something in surplus. In psychosis, the position will rather be like, look, I don't know anything in surplus, but
So it is inverted.
I'm willing to listen and to work with you because you know something that is very difficult to bear. And that's kind of the different position here.
So it seems like it is an inversion, like
Yeah,
in terms of the analyst position.
yeah, absolutely.
It's quite I mean it's fascinating. It's like turning analysis upside down a little bit. I mean, you stay in the book that psychosis, the person's world is turned upside down.
Yeah,
And it seems like in some way the response for psychoanalysis as a practice, the response to that is kind of to turn themselves upside down in a little bit to deal with that.
it is. And therefore, what is conversation? Conversation is really like talking to one another. It's like asking questions, giving responses, and then really exchanging dialogues. And that's really opposite to free association, because what is free association? It's giving someone the duty to speak up. And then, contrary to what happens in ordinary conversation, the analyst will, at crucial moments, remain silent, say nothing, such that a certain unease arises at the level of the analysant, and the analysant continues speaking out of this little experience of unease. Well, we in the treatment of psychosis go a different direction, in the sense that we try to stay connected to the patient and we avoid that experience of disconnection. So here we will see that the analyst often is far more active, active in talking, but also active in staying in touch with the analysant or with the patient. And that's why, for example, in the treatment of psychosis, we usually won't use a couch, because a couch is exactly what usually creates something of a split between the analysant and the analyst. Because when someone is free associating on the couch, then it's really you with your words and with your free association, and you don't know how the analyst is responding to us, because you can't check it non-verbally. And that stimulates the process in neurosis. But that would kind of be like, again, more disorienting in the context of psychosis, because in the context of psychosis, the question of who the other is already so unstable that it's better to have the feeling that you kind of know who the other is for you. So we have to build something of a trust relationship, because the trust in what the other's intentions are is not automatically there. And so therefore, then we will like really work face to face, or maybe also do things with patients, like playing music, or I don't know, doing creative work, exactly from a psycholytic position, um, as more as a peer who is also bringing in materials. But of course, the materials that in a conversation the analyst will bring into the conversation, it's not your private stuff. It's not the things that you have to bring in your own analysis. It's rather that your subjective response to the things that the analysant is working with, that the patient is working with in psychosis, your subjective response to it will be articulated. Like, for example, when someone is talking about artwork that he's doing, or about a specific photography project that someone is doing with his smartphone, and he's photographing moss, for example, on the streets, different formations of moss, and showing it in the sessions, for example, finding that interesting, or saying that there's something of a beauty for me in how moss is growing on the streets. So then I'm bringing in a subjective response without, of course, like bringing my own private little story of the misery of my life. The misery of my life is not helping my patient. So that's not the stuff for the conversation that I bring in as an analyst. But what I do bring in is the fact of subjective experiencing, starting from what the patient brings in.
This year, Philosophy Portal will be at Peter Rollins Wake Festival from April 27th to May 1st for a 5-day transgressive festival that mixes the best in incendiary intellectual exploration with underground art, music, magic, comedy, and talks to forge an experience that embodies the destabilizing essence of pyrotheology. Philosophy Portal will attempt to add to that destabilizing essence of pyrotheology in all of its dirt and depth, with 3 full morning sessions inspired by our work in the Christian Atheism course. At philosophyportal.online, you can find the full schedule for our planned discussions, Q&A, and breakout groups at Wake. I hope to see you there. So, the first question I have here is about the status of the barred subject in psychosis. I think, is it when we're thinking about the barred subject, when we're thinking about the barred subject in relationship to the cause of desire, is that a model that only makes sense for neurosis? And in psychosis, is there a different algebra? Is there a different way to think about that? Are they split subjects in a conventional sense, or how do you make sense of this?
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting question, because I often have the feeling, or that it has been answered in wrong ways by other people. And often the statement is that actually in psychosis we don't have a barred subject, that desire is not present in psychosis. But for me, that's not a very interesting idea. What I do believe is that at moments of psychotic revelation, like for example in a hallucination or in an intuition that lies at the basis of a delusion, then there are moments where something of the subject disappears or tends to disappear. And then Lacan will say this one of his one-liners about psychosis is that they have the cause in their pocket. And with the cause, he means the object A. Whilst in neurosis, the object A is outside of me. For example, in the presumed gaze, when I'm alone in my house, I already wonder how I'm looking as a neurotic, and I'm wondering how I will be looking, and when I leave the house and I go to a pub, how will people, what will people think of me? Well, whilst nobody is there, at the level of the fantasy, the gaze is already there. So it's a presumed entity, and my subjectivity is in relation to an externalized object A. That subjectivity takes shape. But the thing is, says Lacan, that in psychosis, this object A is not a virtual reality. It's a real reality, in the sense that the gaze is there because people have the feeling of being observed, like very specifically that there are cameras or maybe satellites that are observing me, and I can't protect because it's not a virtual thing, it's a real thing. And when this happens, the subject tends uh, to be removed. The subject tends to be destroyed because what is subjectivity? It's not being not one nor the other thing. It's like switching positions. Like there is no signifier that is exactly defining me. Well, in psychosis, there tends to be a signifier that very exactly defines you. For example, I have the impression that satellites are observing me and they want to kill me. Huh? Then I'm not a subject, then I'm a target, not a subject, because then
Can,
this
mm,
very specific signifier, I'm the one who will be killed, is something that is so overwhelming, and there is an impossibility to take a distance from it. And that's the problem that is there in the acute psychotic experience. But that does not mean that in all domains of life and at every moment in their lives that people who struggle with psychosis are in that position. No, no. I think it's at very specific moments, moments of psychotic crisis, at moments that are really the challenge of psychosis. That's what is happening. But what is then the treatment of psychosis? It's exactly a search for a position where something of a subjectivity can be restored. Huh? And that's more specifically still in relation to that.
which would introduce lack,
Yeah. Well,
which would introduce the split in a way. Like
yeah.
I'm trying to get at here. Um, I think you've already said that we shouldn't view neurosis as somehow like a superior symptom or a superior condition or clinical structure to psychosis. um but at the same time, with psychosis, lack is not functioning, and in neurosis, lack is perhaps over dominant. And is there a way in which there are stakes here for how we're thinking about truth? Like you say, for the psychotic, it's as if they're carrying around desire in their pocket, like it's a sort of a ready-made, a ready-made thing. Is there a specific disadvantage to being psychotic that is somehow well, socially problematic?
Well, I think the social is more of a problem for psychosis in the sense, Van, that what is so typical for the psychotic experience is also the experience of loneliness. It's the experience of being very alone in relation to the challenge that you're being confronted with. Um, that's one thing at the level of the psychotic crisis, that this is a problem. It also comes with an advantage. What is the advantage? The neurotic is always the one who is worrying about the other. What will other people think of me? What will other people think of my decision, about my desire? And so there is a continuous search, and there the social is a
That's
problem
interesting.
because it's in a certain sense overwhelming the social,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and there's an uncertainty how to relate to it. And so that's in that disadvantage does not play in the same way in the context of psychosis, but there the question of loneliness and of feeling disconnected and of not making part of the world, uh, of the outside world where seemingly people interact with one another and seemingly know what they are doing. Well, I'm outside of that, uh, and that's a
Hmm.
lonely position. But
Hmm.
but you, I think Lacan helps us to see, like, okay, but maybe it's the psychotic experience in that respect is highlighting something else about the human condition about humanity that is also very true for every human being, because it kind of shows the illusion of neurosis very clearly. Because what is neurosis? In neurosis, people behave as if there is something of a conventional or good opinion about things, whilst psychosis is demonstration that it is not the case.
Mm. I think that's really helpful to think about the way in which neurotics are constantly worried about the other, what the other thinks of them, and the you know the psychotic. The problem is the lack of connection. I think that's also probably, in when you were talking about the historicity and the social dimensions today of urbanization, globalization, marginalization. I think a lot of people today feel atomization.
Mhm.
People feel individualization as something of a problem, and especially in relationship to not feeling like you're a part of civilization. I don't know if here I would throw out automation or
Mhm.
or technology in general as sort of being sort of a contemporary force that is eroding symbolic bonds or eroding human functionality in a certain way that could contribute to this. If you have anything to say about that, I'd be interested. But I also wanted to ask about what you were saying earlier, which seemed to me to point to a connection between psychosis and conspiracy, conspiratorial thinking,
Mhm. Mhm.
and yeah, how you make sense of that dimension as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the experience of suspicion and the experience of that the secret force is disorganizing my life or disorganizing the world is something of a very basic delusional intention or intention, not it's intuition, um, that the other, there is a manipulating other who is doing something with me, who is taking advantage of me in my specific situation. So that very thing is one of the psychotic intuitions that lie at the basis of delusions. So what is this conspiracy then? Of course, when people unite around it, when people share or share the idea that maybe that is true, that there is a hidden force that is disorganizing our lives, um, and there is secrecy around it, then you can of course have that a group starts to be created around that very belief, and this is what we now, I think, observe, for example, at the level of social media, where indeed around this kind of intuitions, people might have shared opinions. And okay, it's from a clinical perspective, um, there is a difference, of course, from a clinical perspective, thinking about it compared to from a social societal perspective. But from a clinical perspective, it's not so strange that this occurs.
Hmm.
Um, like especially in times where there is lots of social disruption, like when, for example, around the corona crisis,
Exactly.
where suddenly
Yeah, yeah.
our usual ways of exchanging, like leaving the house, doing our job, meeting colleagues, it was not possible anymore. So it's a disruption at the level of the other. Um, then it's not surprising that something of a psychotic intuition will be the response to it. So yeah,
As soon as coronavirus hit, I made a video called "Coronavirus and Psychosis" because there were all these
yeah,
conspiratorial thinking coming out, and I mean, yeah, I think it's also interesting to think about what's the difference between the clinical and the social perspective or the political perspective, because from the sort of the social and the political perspective, there are all sorts of weird theories and hypotheses, very improbable theories and hypotheses about what's going on and why, and it can be extremely it could add to the confusion and the disorientation.
yeah, yeah. Well, at the clinical level, we would, of course, in the context of such conspirational thinking, to have conversations around it with someone. Um, but of course, at the level of a societal response, the question is always like, uh, well, what is something of the joint response that we have to it? What is the shared response next to all the very particular kinds of responses that people might have? What is kind of the over the overarching view that as a community we have of this problem? Um, and then of course that means uh, that some conspirational thinking might be a problem for for the collectivity. And that's, of course, like a tension between individuality and the right to express and the respect for how people experience reality on the one hand, but on the other hand, like the necessity of having something of a collectiveness that kind of limits the different individual responses that we might have. And maybe that's also like kind of a challenge today for our culture, because well, that's also what Freud discusses in civilization and its discontents. Well, there's something of group regulation is needed, because if we don't have it, the human being is so disorganized that living together becomes impossible.
Well, I think specifically here with the social dimension, I think there was that tension between, let's say, the overarching view that might have been forwarded by mainstream media, and then the social media,
Yeah.
and the tension between these layers. And I think that was all acting itself out in very interesting ways. But it's, I might want to labor on this a little bit, because it's interesting to think about what's the relationship between the clinic and society, and how does that relationship continue to unfold. Because I feel like when we think about political economy in general, not just in the extreme outlier situations of a coronavirus pandemic, but when you really think about political economy, a lot of people come up with conspiracy theories about, people controlling the economy, or people controlling a certain state, deep state intentions, and sometimes it's hard to disentangle. It's hard to tell whether there's a robust theory here, or whether or not there's a crazy conspiracy here. Like you have the far outliers. You could have someone like, I don't know if you should know David Icke, but
Mm.
he's a British conspiracy theorist who thinks that there are reptiles on the moon controlling political elites, and lots of people follow him and stuff like that. That's an obvious outlier example of probably there aren't reptiles on the moon controlling politicians. But yeah, how do you think about, the way this interfaces, the clinic and society, and how to understand the role of psychosis in this broader sense?
Yeah. Well, I think when we are on that track, there is a certain risk, um, because when we just say conspiracy thinking, that's psychotic thinking, because that could be the tendency. Then again, we start stigmatizing psychosis, uh, as if psychosis is a problem, and therefore they have these conspiracy thoughts, and therefore it's bad. Um, and I think that's a danger for that discussion, because what then disappears is the question of the suffering, and that's for me also always what needs to be central when we discuss psychosis. Psychosis is an experience of extreme disruption in relation to reality, in relation to society, and I think that my role as a psychoanalyst is to kind of highlight that how something of a suffering occurs, and the question then is, and how will society deal with that suffering? And then it's not just a matter of discussing the contents, who is right and who is wrong, and which theory is makes sense and which one does not make sense, because that's just the content. But the question here is, but yeah, the psychotic experience is an experience of suffering, and how do we deal with that suffering? What is the place that we reserve for it? Um, do we take care of it? Do we take care of difference? Where, how is it in our way of living together? How is it expressed that being different is accepted or not? So I think that's a different way of addressing that question, because now when we have this discussion, the regular media and the social media and this two kinds of information, it's an imaginary discussion for me. Like it's black versus white, it's good versus bad, and then it's like a game, who is in charge, who has the most power in the discussion. But well, when it's a question of power, it's also a question of people will be shocked, people will be disappointed, and for me, it's therefore I would switch it to a bit of a different level, and rather that how do we deal with outliers? How do we deal with the fact of being an outlier or functioning in an outlining way? Um,
Sure. I mean, I think that it's really important. What I think you're emphasizing here is that the analyst disposition in these situations is to center the question of suffering. And maybe when we're thinking about it in the context of political economy or society at large, that question can get ignored or overlooked in a certain way. At the same time, sort of trying to surface this tension again, Lacan at the end of his career wrote a book, Triumph of Religion, and sort of brings to this, to my understanding, brings to the surface this tension between the psychoanalytic clinic and the religious organization. And I would say like that in regards to what you're saying about the psychoanalyst staying with the question of suffering, it's almost like whether it's the Christian or the Buddhist or whatever other religious orientation, there is a certain way in which they're also centering that question of suffering, maybe in a different way. And how are we to make sense of this difference? Basically, how are we metabolizing, how are we processing our suffering,
yeah,
whether in the clinic or in a religious setting?
yeah. But I think here, when we look, for example, at the treatment of psychosis, I will not discuss with my patients the content of their delusions. It's not the question, are you right in your conspiracy thinking or not? Is that correct, the claims that you make or not? The question more is, where does the claim come from? What is it that gave rise to the claim? What is it that has been challenging a person in such a way that something of that conspiracy thinking, of something of that delusion, of something of that suffering that occurs because of the fact that there is a delusion, because there's also suffering in people who have this conspiracy theory. So there is suffering in it because they find it something very bad. So there is suffering. But the question is, where does it come from? Uh, and that's a different way of listening to it. Um, and when I said that in the clinical context, therefore we start conversation, and conversation is also about people's lives and people's social contexts and people's challenges and and the difficult situations that they've been going through. Um, and that's the thing to address. And I think also at a societal level, when there is lots of conspiracy thinking, this should kind of encourage us to question, but what are the situations that people have to live in? What is it there? What is their social context? What is their challenge? And then, of course, we end up with the question of how we organize society and what the impact is, for example, of capitalism, of 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 yeah, and many other things, of course, in how life
Totally,
is organized, and that's important, and not just capitalism
absolutely.
in an abstract way, but how very specifically how it might organize poverty in people who maybe work hard but find it very difficult to find their earnings on a monthly basis, or how it disorganizes families because there is no time anymore for one another because
Yeah,
people have
yeah, yeah.
things all the time. And so for me, that's more the question. And also, and what is the impact? What is the impact on a child of living that? What is the impact on a parent of being in such a situation, uh, of living in a very competitive environment or an abusing environment? That's the thing that we should attend to, not the content just of these beliefs, but rather what is their where do they originate from, given such a more broad perspective on what humanity is, what the challenges of humanity are?
I love that. Thanks for bringing that up. And what it highlights for me and the way I've expressed this, so correct me if I'm wrong, is that inspired by I think it's the Science and Truth paper in the Acree, having this idea that psychoanalysts and psychoanalysis as a practice is concerned with the first cause, whereas religion is concerned with the final cause, and that just emphasizing here what you're bringing up, which is the origin and where is this coming from.
Yeah, yeah. And indeed, and here you could say that the first cause is the subjective cause.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
love that.
And the religious one is the metaphysical question.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and that's a really valid way of thinking about reality, but not the psychoanalytic way of thinking about reality. Because here the question for us is
right.
what is the very specific organization of the symbolic system in people's lives?
And you've
And
already emphasized also what's so interesting about psychoanalysis is in regards to this causation matrix that when we become too dominated by scientific thinking, perhaps we get too emphasized on efficient causation, like getting
yeah,
people back to work, getting people, making things functioning very quickly, seeing things as a problem that needs to be solved very quickly. But
yeah,
you've been emphasizing, like not so much this efficiency dimension, but care to the origin.
yeah. And here the idea, of course, is that people are inventive, so people will work. But it does not mean that people will do like labor in the classic sense of earning money and making profit that disappears in the pockets of the capitalist. But people will work because, and that's Lacan's idea also in television, for example, the unconscious is what works. Uh, this is what happens in our consciousness. There is this continuous stream of signifiers, and that's the work of the human being. That's the work, the unconscious work of the subject. So we do work, and psychoanalysis freeing something of that work. And when there is something of a freeing at that level, people will engage. People will leave the rooms where they are locked in a certain sense. People will engage in society. But in innovative, creative ways, which not always serve the stakes of the dominant group.
Might be
Uh,
back to those microcultures, those subcultures that you
yeah,
were talking about, which
absolutely.
might actually have a role in reforming connectivity in a
Yeah,
in a way.
yeah, because that's indeed returning to that point. Um, what we see is that many places where innovative psychosis treatment is offered, they kind of create such places where there is a hospitality um, combined with great creativeness and exploration and making things. Um, artisans' way of producing things is often what happens in in these places.
There was a point of emphasis earlier in the conversation that I thought was really important and that I wanted to bring back up, and you also bring it up in the book. It's about the way in which the psychotic delusion builds on revelation, and that something is revealed to the psychotic, that they have a knowledge, they know it's on the surface. And what is the connection between that and religion? Because you would say that, I mean, I'm even thinking about this in the context of I just was teaching a course on an aspect of German idealism where there's a tension between reason and revelation. And this status of revelation, philosophy doesn't know what to do with. So
Yeah,
you could almost say that philosophy doesn't know what to do with revelation, and
yeah,
the clinic didn't know what to do with psychosis at the beginning.
mhm.
But you're saying it's the psychotic delusion's built on revelation. How do you understand that in terms of its potential connection to the origin of religion or religious subjectivity? Is that a meaningful question?
Yeah, I do think so. Um, but we could wonder to which extent there is something of a revelation that the basis of many of our cultural things, like for example religion. Um, but lots of religion is belief and not revelation. Like most religious people, God didn't speak to them directly. No, no, they heard someone
Right.
told them that God has spoken to another person, like God has
Yeah.
revealed something to Jesus
Secondhand
Christ.
secondhand
Yeah.
revelation.
So he has revealed it to Jesus Christ, and I'm told that was the case, and now it's up to me to believe it or not. So that's usually how religion works. It's believing in the revelation that was given to someone else. But it is the assumption of a revelation at the basis. Uh, and in psychosis, the revelation is there. Something is revealed to them, and here, of course, it's this makes a huge difference also in terms of treatment, because often, like in current psychiatry, it is said that psychosis is a question of false beliefs, that people have false beliefs about the world. Well, from a psychoanalytic perspective, it's not just a belief. It's not just something about which you can argue with people. There is something of a different nature at the basis, and that's the idea of the revelation. And here you could say that there is a similarity between the mystic experience, because in mysticism, the one is really like feeling God, hearing God. There is this link, that there is a similarity with psychosis. And yeah, like, of course, you can, when we now would read the lives of a saint like Saint Franciscus of Assisi, when you would look at his life, he was talking to the animals. Well, what this talk, the animals were saying things to him. Well, he's a saint. Well, when now people say that the animals speak to them, like Schreber, he heard the birds who were communicating with him messages. Well, something of what is the psychotic experience and what is the revelatory experience in the context of mysticism, there is this huge similarity. The difference probably is that in the context of what we now call psychosis, it is usually linked to an experience of disintegration, a disintegration of reality, whilst classically speaking, in mystical literature, it's a revelation that brings joy, that brings the experience of a joyful unity with God. That's often how in literature the opposition is made between the psychotic revelation and the religious or the mystical revelation. But it's a dichotomy that also clinically speaking not always works, because there's quite some patients who have had psychotic experiences who, yeah, who long back to that experience because it was full, it was revelatory, it was
Yeah, yeah.
bringing them something. And when the psychotic experience or the psychotic crisis is over, they are left with something of an emptiness that is very difficult to bear, compared to something of the richness of the psychotic experience. So, therefore, we it's maybe in opposition, the psychotic experience and the mystical experience, but more in the sense of a continuum rather than that there are two different positions. I would rather think of it as a dimension, and it's very difficult for the rational mind of the enlightenment to accept such aspects of human experience, but psychosis testifies to the fact that this is also a possibility for human experiencing to have such experience.
Well, there's a few things I'd like to discuss with you, but I want to bring up this quote because it's too relevant to what you just said in regards to the psychotic and the mystical revelation from Joseph Campbell. He says, "The psychotic drowns in the same waters in which the mystic swims with delight."
Yeah, that's a very nice quote for that.
I mean, it feels like it's
Yeah,
getting at this distinction,
yeah,
no?
absolutely. Yeah.
So connected to that, and what I really wanted to discuss with you is, I know this is important to you, is Lacan, madness, and limit experience in regards to freedom. So, you have this quote in the book from Lacan where he says, "It would not be man's being if it did not bear madness within itself as the limit of this freedom." And just want to get your opinion on whether or not the madness that Lacan's talking about here is kind of the psychotic experience directly. Is this the source of the madness, so to speak?
Well, that's exactly how I read it in the book. Huh? Because, well, there's lots of things to say about that quote, but in Why Psychosis is Not So Crazy, I link it to the status of the drive for the human being. Um, and what is the drive? Well, it's the impulse that is biologically grounded, that lives in us. But the thing is that there is no inherent knowledge in us. We lack knowledge to deal with something of the impulse that is there. And so therefore, this offers a possibility of freedom for the human being. It's open-ended, the drive. We don't know what to do with it, so that's on the one hand very anxiety provoking because we don't know what to do with it, but on the other hand, it gives liberty to the human being. This liberty, neurosis is the limiting of that liberty because it's by believing in symbolic systems and by accepting limitations and accepting guidelines of how to deal with the freedom that we kind of try to limit it and to make it livable, that freedom. So in that respect, the neurotic is not free, and that's usually what it's exactly what the neurotic is saying to us. Like, I want to do this, but I don't manage reaching it because I also want to do that. But they don't do what they want to do. So their freedom is limited and they suffer from it. And here, of course, the idea is when there is this basic foreclosure, as Lacan would say, meaning that the symbolic is not entirely functioning, this actually opens again a space of freedom, a space where an invention is possible, where something new that is not just repetition of what is already there, because neurosis, that's repetition of what mom and daddy already said to you in a slight variation. So it's reproducing the culture, the neurotic strategy, whilst the psychotic strategy is that possibility of inventing new things out of nothing. And therefore, it's it's an exercise in freedom. And therefore, I think Lacan will also stress that in that sense, psychosis or madness is not inferior. It's not an expression of human inferiority or of idiocy of the human being. No, it's something of the potential of the human that is exactly expressed in madness. And that is the potential that is kind of denied in the context of neurosis. And therefore, Lacan will rather say that stupidity is neurotic. It's not wanting to know, he says already in his paper on the mirror stage. The neurotic is the one who does not want to know something. So, which really goes against the idea of the Enlightenment. People want to know more. Well, Lacan says, no, people don't want to know. They refuse to know more. But psychosis is an experience of knowing too much because something is revealed and you
Yeah,
were
it's
not asking
fascinating.
for it. And so, in that respect, it's more attesting to that freedom because if it is revealed to you, what will be your response to it? If there is no canon that is supporting you, that is covering you in dealing with that question, it's up to you. And that's like a challenge and a very lonely position, but at the same time, an illustration of what a crucial aspect of what a human being is. So, therefore, that idea that madness is not an illustration of human inferiority or pathology or this or yeah of a deficiency of being human, but rather no, it's 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 the key aspect of disruption that is humanity that is demonstrated most clearly actually in madness.
I think that what's coming to my mind in this conversation, and perhaps it was even re-emphasized with this Joseph Campbell quote, is that there does seem to be a fault line or a division between, and this is very actual in sort of my networks and people I collaborate with, between, say, people who are very influenced by Lacan and people who are very influenced by Jung. And whether or not this influence and whether or not this disposition of appreciation has something to do with neurosis and psychosis, or whether or not there's something that people who are more drawn to Jung are inspired by sort of the psychotic revelation itself. And the reason why I'm asking that is because in chapter 5 you start by saying that when Jung broke with Freud, and I've loved this point because I've often made this point, so when you brought it up I was sort of felt like a validation of some kind. But that you say that after Jung broke with Freud, there was kind of a relationship between his psychotic revelations and the break with Freud itself, that he no longer had a certain support there from a paternal figure or from a mentor figure. But the question there, I'm not sure if it's clear, is that if what's going on in the Jungian tradition perhaps is what you call this courage to confront psychosis.
Mhm.
Even though there's not a final solution to it, there's a certain bravery, there's a certain courage there. Is what I'm saying clear?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I do see the tension, but I think it's a different way of engaging with psychosis, and you could say that Jung engaged with psychosis from a first person perspective. Also, not only because he was also working with people with psychosis, but he has had something himself of that experience and took it very seriously, and and kind of made a step more clearly than Lacan towards reading the content of such experience, and the possibility that something of a wisdom is in there. And I think that's usually the Jungian project. It's by what that's what Jung did, is was by reading his own unconscious, which was revealed to him, um, and making the black books and the red book, and taking that very seriously as 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 informative of human psychology. That's in my view the way Jung went, whilst Lacan's knowledge about psychosis is about interacting with psychosis. It's not so much, or I don't think Lacan was starting from a psychotic position himself.
No, I don't
But
think
he
so.
was, he was having that dialogue
Yeah.
continuously with psychosis.
Mm.
Of course, that's something of a different position, I think, they start from, and then maybe indeed that explains the split between those two movements within psychoanalysis.
Well, I've often interpreted it as that Jung, I love the way you're saying it, that Jung had a firsthand experience with psychosis, and that swimming in those waters, so to speak, if we could invoke the Joseph Campbell metaphor or analogy, that Jung was kind of after the break with Freud operating outside of psychoanalysis in mystical waters, and what he's doing is I've heard some people say that what Jung's doing is kind of building a kind of personalized religion, or that he's a modern mystic more than a psychoanalyst. Is that unfair?
No, no, I can follow the point. Absolutely. Yeah.
Whereas for Lacan, you're saying there's more of a, say, scientific external approach to psychosis.
Well, yeah, absolutely. In the sense that for Lacan, it's the interaction, through the interaction, that he knows psychosis, and it's always marked by something of lack. Um, and that's always in Lacan's theory. It's about lack, and lack also, of course, like in him relating to the psychotic experience, in between himself and the psychotic experience, there's something of a gap. Um, and that's always in Lacan crucial, also in understanding his theory about psychosis starts also from that gap.
I would say then, at least because I often find myself, well, no, as a general rule, I do find myself kind of on the Lacanian side of interpreting things. Is am I right to say that there's an ontological question here in terms of, I would assume that the Jungian who has a firsthand experience of psychosis, you're saying, takes that very seriously and thinks that there's wisdom in this experience, is also presupposing a kind of ontology there,
Mhm.
which Lacan would relate to from the position of lack?
Yeah, I think so. In Lacan, there is, you could say, rather a non-tology, in the sense that there is a non.
Exactly,
Uh,
exactly, exactly.
uh, and
So the
Lacan,
non-relationship is suspended
yeah,
in for the
absolutely.
for the mystic.
Yeah, yeah. And Lacan will not have a theory about wisdom, because for Lacan, wisdom, in the sense that having specific contents that are wise, something that is contradictory to his theory. All there is finding your way in dealing with the non rapport, um, savoir-faire, do your thing with it, live it in a certain sense. But the thing is that it cannot be copied. So there is no wisdom, there is no one who is hierarchically better than the other in a certain sense in dealing with it. Um, I think that that's a bit the point in Lacan's idea, because the lack, the real, the disruption is there for everybody.
Yeah, beautifully said. Is there any sort of further comment on this distinction between the ontological fullness and the non-rapport that we should emphasize? Does it have consequences for ethics? Does it have consequences for the way we interpret society outside of the clinic? What do you think are the stakes here of this difference? I mean, what I'm trying to say is there a real are there real theoretical, philosophical stakes here for the distinction between Jung and Lacan on questions of ontology?
Um, it's a challenging question for me to just on the spot say
Sure.
something about. But of course, it really has, I think, implications like the
That's my
ethical,
intuition.
yeah, the ethical implication. Lacanian theory, in terms of ethics, will always start again from that lack. Um, and it's the question, what is good, what is bad? It's a matter of a not knowing that we start from, and not we know that people distinguish between good and bad. But can we, from a psychoanalytic perspective, say at the level of content what is good or what is bad? I think that it's very difficult from a Lacanian perspective, and therefore, when Lacan will answer that question, he will give something like a procedural answer, like there is only good speech, speaking well, ethics of the well spoken, he will say, and that's what he will stress, like the good that psychoanalysis has to offer for humanity. It is that psychoanalysis demonstrated that speech, that good speech is possible. There is bad speech, there is empty speech, there is full speech, and full speech is not to be seen at the level of the content, but is in the sense that something of the disruption that makes up the unconscious can come to the fore. So, well, of course, this has ethical implications from Lacanian perspective, but I'm not enough a Jungian to answer the question on how a Jungian ontology would bring a different kind of answer to that.
Mm. No, I know it's a difficult one, but it's at the same time something that I see comes up again and again and again. I think that there is a difference between Lacanians and Jungians, which um, yeah, I'm not really 100% sure how to interpret it, but the starting point in terms of what you're saying in regards to Lacan with the non-relationship and sort of living with the non-relationship, that it's not something that needs to be overcome or filled is I think an important one to stay with. And
Well,
yeah,
Cathal, maybe you should organize a discussion between a Lacanian and a Jungian
I
to.
do. Yeah, no, I think yeah, maybe I'll go in that direction eventually. But in terms of closing on your book and sort of some final reflections for your book for people who who either haven't read it yet or are considering picking it up. Yeah, what would you say as a way to dive in, and who is this book ultimately for?
Well, the thing is that I wrote it for. Um, I wanted to read to write a readable book, not just for scholars in psychoanalysis, but rather for those who have been confronted with psychosis. And who are those confronted with psychosis? It might be because you have had psychotic experiences yourself. It might be because one of your friends or your family members has had a psychotic experience, or it might be because you, as a scholar, have been confronted with the question of psychosis, but more than as a theoretical question or a philosophical problem. So the book is written for this broad audience who are confronted with psychosis. Um, and then it's kind of a Trojan horse, the book, because And because inside is Lacan, inside is a psychoanalyst, uh,
Yeah, yeah,
with
yeah.
which I'm in a dialogue. Um, and I start from the ethical position of psychoanalysis in the book, both in how I describe my clinical work, um, and also how I engage with the other examples that are in there, because I speak about my own clinical practice, but I also talk about some artists like David Lynch, who just passed recently,
Yeah, rest in peace.
um, and Jung and Yuyai Kusama and several others. Um, so I try to engage also with a broader cultural field where the question of psychosis and madness has been explored, to kind of broaden it up and make clear also that the question of psychosis is not just the question of people in psychiatric institutions, um, but rather like, no, this is a very broad question. Also, knowing that how many people are affected by psychosis makes clear that it's not just a few, and it's not just a specific group. It's something that concerns us all, and that's why I wrote the book, and that's probably also, I guess, why people will read it, because they have been triggered by the question of psychosis, by the possibility of psychosis, and I attempt to to offer a new perspective that goes beyond the question of our dominant societal view, who sees it as a biomedical illness,
Yeah.
uh, who has his specific opinions about dangerousness, for example. Like, for example, is also a film like Joker with Joaquin Phoenix,
Yeah.
that in a sense, it's aesthetically speaking an interesting movie, but it's so stigmatizing, where the Joker figure is ultimately a dangerous figure,
Hmm.
and and this is something that, in my opinion, is very, very wrong, in approaching psychosis.
Well, it's been a pleasure to speak with you about it, and I appreciate the opportunity to go into some of the nuances and some of the theory behind what's really informing the core of this book. I encourage everyone to check it out, and there'll be links in the description to it if you haven't picked it up yet. I'll give you the final word, and then we'll sign off for the night.
Okay, well, I'm just want to thank you for having this conversation. It was my pleasure to talk about the book. I was passionate in writing it, and so it's good that I can share something about it, with other people.
All right. Have a great evening, everyone. The portal is a living, thinking community. Becoming a member of the portal gives you access to 4 live events every month, but more importantly, an opportunity to learn how to think with others, to learn with online creators and para academics, and to develop your own capacity as a philosopher. Becoming a member of the portal also gives you access to the history of our recordings, as well as discount access on past and future courses. This year, members also get exclusive access to the Slovenian School Reading Group, as well as the year-long course focused on Deleuze and analysis. To learn more or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online. This year, Philosophy Portal will be at Peter Rollins Wake Festival from April 27th to May 1st for a 5-day transgressive festival that mixes the best in incendiary intellectual exploration with underground art, music, magic, comedy, and talks to forge an experience that embodies the destabilizing essence of pyrotheology. Philosophy Portal will attempt to add to that destabilizing essence of pyrotheology in all of its dirt and depth, with 3 full morning sessions inspired by our work in the Christian Atheism course. At philosophyportal.online, you can find the full schedule for our planned discussions, Q&A, and breakout groups at Wake. I hope to see you there.